Welcome to Artificiality, the podcast from Helen and Dave Edwards from Sonder Studio. We created Sonder Studio to empower humans in our complex age of machines, data, and AI. Through our strategy, innovation, and change services, we help organizations activate the collective intelligence of humans and AI. We work with leaders in tech, data, and analytics to co-create AI strategies, design innovative AI products and services, and craft change management programs that help their people succeed in an AI-powered, data-centric, complex world. We leverage the new world of foundation models, generative AI, and low-code environments to create an amplified human-machine experience centered on machines that can be a mine for our minds. You can learn more about us at getsonder.com. We are deeply interested in the intersection of the digital and material worlds, both living and not living. Most of our interviews are focused on the intersection of humans and machines. How does the digital world affect humans, and how do humans affect the digital world? This interview, however, is about the intersection of plants and machines. Harpreet Sareen works at the intersection of digital and material, plant and machine, and art and science. His work challenges people to consider the life of plants, what we can learn from them, what we can see and what we can't see. His art and science projects challenge us to wonder if we can actually believe what we're seeing. We moved to the Cascade Mountains to be able to spend more time in the wilderness. We likely spend quite a bit more time in nature than most people. Despite our strong connections to nature, Sarpreet's work accomplishes his goal of encouraging us to reconsider this relationship, to consider what an increased symbiosis might be. Harpreet Sareen is a designer, researcher, and artist, creating mediated digital interactions through the living world, with growable electronics, organic robots, and bionic materials. His work has been shown in museums, featured in media in over 30 countries, published in academic conferences, viewed on social media more than 5 million times, and used by thousands of people around the world. He has also worked professionally in museums, corporates, and international research centers in 5 countries. He is currently an assistant professor at Parsons School of Design in New York City, and directs the Synthetic Ecosystems Lab that focuses on post-human and non-human design. Harpreet, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for inviting me today.
Can you start off by telling us what inspired you to get into this field?
It is such a timely moment to talk about this. I've been thinking a lot about different material worlds that have manifested today. Our digital worlds are becoming more and more real. Our material worlds are becoming more and more artificial. And there's a tension between these fields. But I think the actual sweet spot is somewhere in the middle where we're going to land. And this is where I'm trying to operate all of my research, creative work, and media art. I grew up in the north of India near the Indus Plains in a state called Punjab. And Punjab is an agrarian economy. You would most famously know this place for the Green Revolution that happened there in 1960s when India became food surplus. So I was brought up in a place where I would see nature all of the time. And I was really inspired by seeing all the agricultural technologies that were also kind of coming up at that same time. And I would see those coming up together, and it always was on the back of my mind when I was pursuing my engineering works about how do we bring all of these things together? How do we not think of humans as so separate from ourselves, from our nature? And that's what has been keeping me inspired for doing all of this work. In general, I think at the intersection of nature-based responses and our own computational materiality, there lies something powerful, something that is not constrained by the digital world's ones and zeros. And in the case of plants that I look a lot in my own research, this means properties such as self-repairing, self-powering, self-fabricating, something that is only aspirational to silicon-based materials. We don't have any electronics that work like that today. And so I'm just inspired by what is happening in nature and trying to figure out what are the hybrids that will actually keep us, cohesive rather than very divergent in our development going forward.
I mean, it's such a. First of all, I'm going to say to listeners, you got to follow.
You got to follow the links.
You got to sit down and actually look at some of these videos while we're talking, because they're really quite astonishing. But let's go. I want to start really at the very beginning of which is the engineering side. So the thing that fascinated you about that, and then why plants?
Right. So, I mean, my own research, for the viewers as well, my own research started from a field that we call as human-computer interaction. And human-computer interaction is all about making technologies more and more human. And I've been in that field for a while now. I was working in formats to extract the digital out of the screen, to wrap it onto the world, to make displays that are holographic, displays that are flying, ambient media that is in the physical spaces, and even terrariums that you can talk to and ask what's the weather in Seattle like, and it'll make the weather like in Seattle. And somewhere along the line, I started to question, what does it really mean to be human? And you know, at that time, I took a hard left to fundamentally change the media itself that I was working with. And at this point, it's less only engineering focused. It's focused on multiple dimensions. Sometimes things are a little funny. They are sometimes sarcastic, sometimes through personal observations, and other times, related to the culture of how we actually see nature. And I think as an exercise, we can try something here as well. I would like to unravel here for you how we see nature in a certain way in this part of the world, especially, why it came to be this way, and why I hope that it'll leave you with more questions. So maybe a prompt for your viewers and for you as well. Close your eyes and think of a scene in nature, and we'll count to 10 seconds. Okay, you can open your eyes. And I'd like to ask you and your viewers both, did you imagine a human in this scene? Yes or no?
No.
Yes.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh.
You.
Oh.
Wow.
I saw.
I feel a bit left alone.
Sorry, babe.
Man, story of my life.
You might have been standing behind me, but no, there was definitely lakes, trees, and maybe a chipmunk.
Yeah.
No, I think this is exactly what I ask my students, all the people that I come in contact with in many ways, not explicitly sometimes this question, but it's there. It has an undertone in all of the engineering materials research that we do. Mm-hmm. So the question was, did you see a human or not? And majority of the people, about 99% of the people say we did not see a human in this scene of nature that we imamed.
There you go, you're special.
I'm special, I'm 1%.
You're the 1%. There you go.
And so I think this is what we're going to explore today, this separation between humans and nature that we have generated quite artificially, where we imagine humans as so separate from nature, is what I'm trying to question every day in all of the works that I do. And I think in many of the engineering works, as you asked about, it's not, I think, in general, in the world today, it's not that we just need engineering or scientific advances only. We also need direct cultural engagement from people about all of these technologies, not just one directional coming from a scientist or an engineer, but really in the form of open interpretation, alternative fictions, and debates to inform where we should go. And this work then kind of becomes, it starts sometimes with engineering, it starts sometimes with abstraction, but it leaves people with more and more questions that hopefully informs the overall discourse as well.
So when you set about doing a project, and I wonder if it's useful to sort of describe one of the projects that you've done and the process of building it and testing it, and then almost sort of allowing it to become both art and science, both living and not living. And I think that as I watch some of the videos of this, I find my mind toggling back and forth between whether I can really believe what I'm seeing.
Yes, I mean, I would like people to ask those questions. In fact, I mean, if those were the questions that were coming up in your head, I intended for those questions to come up, where people quite often ask, is this natural? Let's take an example, and we'll kind of get through that example to get to the bigger questions then as well. In general, in my opinion, I've been studying plants for almost a decade now, and when I look at plants, the physiological signaling or the electrochemical signaling inside the plants is so similar to what goes on in our own bodies. And I think plants are kind of these signal networks that occur in nature. There's a striking similarity between plants and our electrical circuits, how they sense, how they exchange, and how they display information. And the question that I've been asking myself is, what would the symbiosis between these two look like? A true symbiosis. And this is always a sliding scale, in many of these projects, where we are trying to get to, a symbiosis that is truly beneficial to both. So I tried something in one of my projects. It's called Elovan, a plant whose electrochemical responses are wired to a mobile robot. There are lamps on either side of the robot, and these lamps are switched on and off alternately. When you switch on or off these lamps, they induce natural potentials inside the leaves of a plant. Those natural potentials, they feed into the robot, and the bot just follows the light with the plant's own responses. This is a bot driven by a plant and not the other way around. And we often see this in bacteria, for example, when we study developmental bioelectricity. Quite often, when we observe bacteria, we can change the behavior or the movement of a bacteria by either adding light or adding food. But we never try, usually, electricity, especially in microbiology labs. But if you take two electrodes and you put them in a bacterium petri dish, and you switch them on and off, you'll see that the bacteria will start to go towards electrical signals or away from electrical signals, just because of how they are regulating their own internal signaling as well. And this is where you fundamentally start to see, some similarities between organisms, such as bacteria, such as plants, and actually even humans. We also have the same kind of bioelectricity in our own bodies. Not exactly the same, but kind of similar. And so I was just really wanting to show or express, what does a plant robot look like? Is this a robot plant? A plant robot? There are similarities between, or differences between these two actually, where who's taking the lead? Is it the plant taking the lead or the robot taking the lead? And so I've been studying some of these projects where we create materials that are so ingrained inside the plant body that they become indistinguishable, but not as an extraneous factor, but really kind of integrated well within the body of a plant. Sometimes these are functional, other times these are open-ended. So Elovan is an open-ended artistic expression, and it has gone through several exhibitions, around the world. But I think one more functional example before we get to the discussion around this. In design, which is the field that I operate in, the word affordances often comes up. What does a cup handle afford us? Or, any objects that we design, what does that afford us? But I think, what are the biological affordances of the plants, so that we can start to think of technology in conjunction with the plants? And so if you think of an example, in Flint, Michigan, when the water was poisoned with lead, the front lines of the rivers had only plants and trees. Plants and trees are often the first detectors of whatever is happening in the environment. We don't have to do this. They already do this. Weeds that we often call as undesirable in our lawns and gardens, they are the hyper accumulators of lead in the environment. They automatically bioremediate and remove lead out of the environment. So I was really inspired of one of these ecologists who was talking about weeds in this way. And I started to look at plants at the front line in Flint, Michigan, what if we could have done this detection much earlier than 1 month later? So we designed this project called Argus. It's a plant which relies on a house plant's natural uptake of water. This uptake that the plant normally does affords continuous sampling, and it kind of makes the plants an ideal platform for sensing stuff that is happening in the surrounding environment. What we do is we take the leaf of a plant, we invert it backwards, and we inject nanosensors, materials that are really small, and they stay within the intercellular space or the intracellular space of the plant. And when a plant comes in contact with any toxic analytes, they go through the plant vasculature and they will eventually come in contact with these sensors that are now inside the leaves. These sensors will have a structural change, and they will either produce a glow or they will stop the glow to inform a human that there is now lead in the water. In contrast to silicon-based materials that we design, we don't have to rely on electricity or electric motors to do this, where a plant could be, sensing stuff in the environment all of the time. And not just lead, it could be an independent platform to analyze many things in the environment. So we've not done anything extraneous to the body. We've just added one capacity that relies on the plant's continuous uptake of water. And we have basically enabled for the humans to see what is happening inside the plant.
Can I get a sort of detail for just a second? Because I'm curious. What are the materials that you're using for these nanosensors, and what's the life cycle? You introduce them into the plant in some way. Plants don't live, forever. How do you have to do you recapture them? What's that? Help us understand that integration.
Yes, I will talk about the process and then a little bit about the life cycle as well.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, we don't know much about the life cycle because these are still currently in the lab kind of scenarios, and we haven't done anything outdoors until we know a lot more. But I was really just kind of studying agricultural biotechnologies, and I saw one paper which talks about how tomatoes can be grown bigger by puncturing the cell walls using some techniques. And I was looking at this paper and was just so inspired of how this can happen in biotechnologies. And I thought, what if they can inject this to puncture the cell walls, something that is so harmless to the plants, then can we also just kind of keep something in the plant physiology that stays there and is able to serve as a detection platform? So what we did was we take carbon nanotubes, which are nanomaterials, off the shelf. We functionalize them with double-stranded DNA. And this double-stranded DNA is able to detect a particular kind of lead. And we put the double-stranded DNA onto the carbon nanotubes, and that's what we inject inside the leaves of the plant. That stays there for the amount of experiments that we have done, which is about from 2 days to about 2 weeks. It stays there within the same intercellular space. Now, when the lead is injected in water, the double-stranded DNA that was on top of the carbon nanotubes gets cleaved and becomes single-stranded, and there's a sort of structural change that happens because of which the light that was falling on the sensors earlier gets shifted into a different spectrum, and that's how you see the turn on or the turn off effect that I mentioned before. And that's how you design these sensors normally. But we basically took these sensors and tried to inject them inside the plants to take them into a very different kind of detection platform.
So one of the I saw one of the videos was that I watched was algae, and part of your goal, it seemed, to help people understand that plants, there's this whole soundscape that comes. Can you describe that project a bit and the response, how it worked, the responses that you got from people? Because I think that was a really interesting way of helping people understand the difference between there's just the different sensory and the different perceptions that are out there that we just don't have available to us, but how technology can make that more available to us.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I was hoping our conversation would get there, and it did. I think, as I mentioned, this sentence that has actually been one of the goals of my work in the lab is, what are the translation mechanisms for humans to see things that are inside animal and plant physiologies? And I brought up the example of a plant robot where you don't see it like you see it in a microscope or something, or you don't measure it like you measure it on an oscilloscope or something, but you really just see it as a robot that is going left and right, and you're somewhat provoked by it. You're like, why is this happening? And this is the question that comes up about who's taking the lead, the plant or the robot. But in the same way, what are the translation mechanisms for humans to see things inside plant physiologies? Algae came up in one of the field experiments that I was doing in the Bay Area. I was doing some field experiments near the Exploratorium in San Francisco, and I took a hydrophone with me and I dipped it underwater, and I started to hear this cackling sound, kind of like fried eggs on a pan in the morning, and I was like, that's really strange. Maybe my hydrophone is not working well. And I tried that in a different location. I kept moving around the coast. I took it to different places where there were just lakes and not really an open ocean. And I still kept getting a similar kind of sound signature. And I was just surprised, and I thought maybe this is shrimp. Shrimp have been known to kind of clap or slap their tails together, and they make these sounds. But I knew that they don't make these sounds in the day, and they often make this during the nights, especially loud. And I talked to a marine biologist, and turns out there are no shrimp in that part of the bay. And I was still very surprised. I was confused what is happening. So we took algae samples from the Bay Area, and we isolated them, did some control experiments. We put them in aquariums, only one single species of algae, such as red ogo or sea lettuce, the most commonly known species of algae. And turns out when algae is producing photosynthesis, it produces bubbles. And these bubbles, when they are about to leave, they shake. And that shaking produces sound. And that sound rings in the hydrophone. And if you imagine many, many bubbles together, that's what it starts to sound like, a fried egg on a pan. The same question came up, why don't we know about this? It's 2022 or 2023. I mean, we don't know about this behavior. We see algae all of the time. Why? And I think it's because of the cultural perception as well. Algae is a very undesirable species. It is often labeled as smelly, something that is dirty. And I think this cultural perception needs to change somehow. And that's what I started to work towards, to figure out phenomena where people could actually reevaluate or refocus their relationships with some of these species that are around them. We designed an installation that I was doing during the pandemic times. People were so away from oceans and any of their ecologies, even in the local environments. And so I wanted to design something that brings them closer in some way to this phenomena. So we had 3 aquariums, one in New York, one in Linz in Austria, and one in Tokyo, with all different species of algae. And we kind of opened up this platform as a distributed platform where you could, as humans, record something. This recording would be translated into light variations that would be actually playing over an aquarium over a longer period of time. And then, this light variation would produce bubble variations in algae that we are recording through hydrophones. And we email those bubble variations back to people. And incidentally, I started to also observe, as people did more and more recordings, they were sending more and more recordings. People would ask strange questions, or sometimes funny questions, or sometimes just say hello. people would say, have you ever wondered what it's like to live on the land? Or thank you for giving us oxygen, or, why does your sound like it's meditation, or something similar. And so there were all of these really kind of good inputs coming in from people as well that I was also really inspired by. Someone said, live long and prosper. Just that phrase itself is so inspiring, to go and play into an aquarium as light variations. Now we are trying to figure out a way where we take such a project to local communities where people can dip the hydrophones themselves in water, understand some of the species in their environment, and just kind of have a very different relational scenario than they would otherwise be used to.
The boundaries that you're pushing in lots of ways, multiple things, right? Just nudging multiple boundaries. You've got, how do you use technology to unlock different sensory experiences for people so that they get a different appreciation for the complexity in our ecosystems and the role that a algae species, which is generally seen as undesirable or inconvenient, giving people a sense of wonder about that. So it's so that it's pretty easy to save the whales, harder to save the algae, right? So it's giving them a sense of proximity, a sense of being part of the same system, a delight, a wonder, that kind of thing. But then you've also got projects that are pretty technically focused on how can we think about this as a new human-computer interface. How does that? How would the technology work? How could we have an Internet of Things that's biological? Is that more efficient? Biological systems are pretty efficient and do things in an analog way that silicon doesn't, and it can be it can be a better solution. I think these are very interesting. There's people researching solar panels that are photosynthetic. There's the every time I look at how a ribosome works, it's like, that's just astonishing. The little and molecular motors inside of our cells. How do you think about that sort of next stage of what is essentially sort of botanical cybernetics, or of unlocking and scaling the physiological processes into things that can be integrated into the electronics we have?
My approach is to formulate symbiotic associations and to place technology in conjunction with the plant functions. In doing so, while we are often attaching electrodes, let's say silver electrodes in a plant, to read their electrochemical signals, we also like to understand what is happening inside the plant physiology as well. And for that, we study we study the time scale of how the plant is growing, or what does it do in different stages of its life. We study where the plant is growing, its physiologies and its senses, of the plants with the following goals: to understand what does choice and control look like, what does the technological merger look like when we design some of these experiments. So one of the experiments that we can kind of jump to is a project that I call as Cyborg Botany, where we took some polymers that come from the solar panel industry. It's an organic semiconductor that is usually found in a lot of anti-static packaging as well. We prepared a water-soluble variant of this polymer called ProDot with the help of chemists at MIT, and we put the plant in it for 24 to 48 hours. And this was stem cuttings of rose. Rose is known to drink a lot of water, so the xylem of the rose is quite big, and so it's really good species for this experiment. We sliced the bark of the rose after doing this experiment, and we observed that inside the xylem of a plant, there's a single nanowire, a single continuous nanowire that ended up growing from the chemicals that were inside the water. So essentially, just to recap, water with soluble electronics, we put the rose cuttings, and those polymerizes as a single nanowire inside the xylem of a plant. And it was surprising to us because this was a continuous channel. It doesn't fully hinder the xylem. And I think overall, the goal of the project is not just to grow the wire, it's of course also to figure out if this is harming the plant in any way. And we did not observe any self-defense indicators in the plant for the duration of the experiment. Again, these are stem cuttings, and we haven't done this in a whole plant. But for the duration of the experiment, we did not observe any self-defense indicators in the plant that would otherwise say that the plant will not grow to its fullest health. But now it has a small nanowire inside it. What do you do with a plant that has wires inside it? I mean, as an interaction designer, we of course tried some things that turns the plant into touch sensor, motion sensor, antenna, and so on and so forth. But I think this was an exercise to kind of stretch, the imagination about what is possible to human interaction. But I think the face of the technology is going to look much more different than what we showed. The idea was to show these possibilities to maybe, nudge people in this direction. But really, I think this is an organic, biodegradable polymer that doesn't harm the plant. It's not meant to harm the species around it. And it should be a different way of thinking electronics, where electronics could be grown instead of fabricating on silicon-based things. And so this is where I'm saying, this is how it's going to look different. But I think the way we tried it is one way, where we are continuously trying to figure out, botanical electronics, or different ways of thinking about electronics than just silicon-based electronics.
How do you think about the data, the information that we might be able to gather through this kind of interaction? If you think about the vast potential of AI, we talk about it a lot on this podcast, but there's a core limitation in that it's lack of understanding of the embodied world. And I wonder if you've explored that and thought about what an AI system might be able to learn more about the natural world through this kind of integration.
It's one of the biggest gaps in AI today, which is it has all this understanding of data that is coming from the humans. But even the human papers, all of the knowledge that we have today, it doesn't have anything related to the plant data, because plants obviously don't speak the same language that we do, and so all the data is actually just kind of meaningless to ChatGPT and whatever. I think, doing an experiment like this, where we grow wires inside the plants, one of the biggest potentials is to use this as a relay, as a communication channel between the digital world and between the plant world. We have done something like this already, where we actually press on a button on the computer, and then it sends a signal to the plant, and it closes the leaf of a Venus flytrap. This is opposite to reading the signals that we were doing in a robot plant. But in this other project, which we call as phytoactuators, what we do is we press a button on the leaf. It sends a very similar electrochemical signal to the plant, and it closes the leaf of a Venus flytrap. And we were just kind of figuring out, is there a possibility of kind of a botanical interface where we don't really have to use a display, and maybe the plant ever so slightly nudges a human to do something, like a weather indicator or something similar. Just a small exercise. But I think it points to the same direction that you're talking about, a digital communication bridge between the plant world and the digital world. And I think the nanowires that we have grown inside plants, they have a very direct application here. With some more research, it is possible that we might be able to build that relay, the communication bridge that brings all this knowledge from the plant world into the digital world. But we'll have to keep doing this over and over with different plants, and really have to put an emphasis in this area. And I think that's where, the research needs to go. It's only a handful of people working in this area with very specific knowledge. And I think one of the biggest gaps in AI is around this data. But if we had access to this data, not only it strengthens our metaphorical relationship with the plants to really figure out what is happening inside them, but also it really changes the way we look at our crops, our fields, the way we need to approach, some of our growth mechanisms, especially in fields where we may not have to rely on such strong pesticides. But I'm pointing at such long-term ramifications of this work that this is all possible. And it is not necessary that we have to go all the way to growing wires inside the plants. This is even possible by focusing on long-term research on this, by just using in vitro mechanisms or wires that are outside the plants. So, overall, there's a pretty big gap in AI that needs to be fixed in some way or form in the future.
I'm sitting here wondering if I could eat a plant that had a nanowire in it. But I guess you could have, that's a long way off. But what a fascinating idea that you get that there's a way to bridge the physical and digital world, not by instrumenting per se, but actually these cybernetic. I mean, in the theme of two questions: what's next for the research? What are the projects you want to do? And then the second question is a little bit, how far is this research to something where you might want to spin out a company or actually create a product? What are you thinking about that you want to do with your work?
Great question. I mean, I'll respond to this in different ways. The first thing, eating a plant with nanowires inside it is not very different than eating a plant with pesticides in it. And I'm not saying we should do both. I'm saying we should probably do neither, But what I'm saying here is there are biodegradable alternatives to growing electronics that we should look at. This is an extremely critical area that is undervalued, underplayed, and has large ramifications. Same as what we are now going towards, organic growth in the agricultural world with more and more techniques that are putting emphasis on that area. We should also put emphasis on organic technologies, in a very similar fashion. Now, the second layer to this question, what's next? We have recently published a work that I'm actually really excited about. As I mentioned in the beginning of this call, I'm from India, and of course in India we look at all of these plants and we relationship with plants in very different ways. In the eastern part of India, in a region called Meghalaya, in Shillong, there are living bridges where people actually take the aerial roots of banyan trees or fig trees, they intertwine them together, and they create a bridge that people can walk on, and they actually use them as functional bridges for their communities. And these bridges are an example of a self-growing, self-repairing architecture in India that has lasted for more than 500 years. Concrete structures cannot do this because they degrade over the years, but this architecture repairs itself. And so I was really inspired, and we looked at this process for such a long time. We tried to study how people are doing all of this work. And we came up with this experiment that we have published about it, and we are about to release a video on this very soon as well. But basically, we studied this by using sunflowers. Sunflowers grow by 4 inches per week. We have a robot that is actually living on the sunflower, a self-sufficient robot that is not relying on an external scaffolding, but is actually living on the stem of a sunflower. The sunflower grows up by 4 inches per week. The robot also goes up by 4 inches per week. But along with that, the robot has onboard lighting that is slightly able to morphologically control in which direction the plant should grow or is growing. And by doing this, we are able to program the robot with certain growth structures that actually grows the plant in the same fashion automatically. And we published the work, very specifically around units that could be spiral, or it could have an S-shaped growth, or something that can just make it into a very curved shape. But some flowers are 45-day experiments or 6-week experiments. The experiments that we have done are very limited in one way, but they are also pointing to the future where we can imagine growing structures where you leave these robots for a long duration and they can finally grow frameworks that could use in architecture or furniture. Or imagine going to a bamboo forest where you leave these robots to find an architectural framework over a long period of time. Such robots, in that case, would probably not rely on lighting as we do in our indoor experiments. They would probably rely on gravity or just solar power to actually grow, bamboo into automatically different shapes. So this is one of the recent experiments that we have done. And in terms of your question of the company, it's so timely as well because there is a conversation around building some of these innovations into, an approachable electronic circuit that can basically tell us, the current conditions from inside the plant by studying the electrochemical signals. And I'm working with someone who's really interested in taking this up as a company, and I'm taking on an advisory role in this company where the company will actually be rolling out some of these things. So that is happening. It's in the works. I can't say a lot more about the company, but you'll see it probably towards the end of the year with more data on long-term growth as well.
It's interesting because you spend time and just sort of allow your mind to wander, and the idea of having a robot that can attach to a plant and create a chair. You can see how people would buy it to be able to have an artistic structure in their garden, and that would be incredible to see how that could actually come to be.
I mean, people, there are definite artistic communities that are pursuing this work in the form of tree shaping, where people do this over long periods of time. And there are people in Europe that have also scaled this up into, kind of scaffolding that they can have in their fields, and they would use the scaffolding to grow bamboo into repeatedly different kinds of chairs or structures that you would need in your house. The motivation for us was to automate this and to really have some kind of future-oriented process where we could do this over a long period of time with many, many species and nudge the architectural world in a different direction. I also think, in your questions earlier, all of these technologies, I mean, they are at such a tension point. There is technology and then there's plants, and then, something that, again, we have been thinking about it so differently. And it's hard to bring them together. But I have certain instances that I think fundamentally change the way that I think about, this merger as well. Especially because of where I was brought up. When I grew up, my mother bought a few houseplants when I was born. And those houseplants are still there in our home today. They're as old as I am. And I learned those values of deep coexistence with nature. And as I mentioned, because of where I grew up, the culture itself has a different relationship with nature, where we have courtyards that would bring the nature in while also living in its literal surroundings. And I think in this part of the world, the imagination of nature is a little bit different. I mean, it also varies from where you're living. It's also different in the East Coast versus the West Coast. Where John Muir on the West Coast changed the perception of people of looking at nature. And on the East Coast, we have such an urban relationship to nature, where we are looking at rats in New York City and squirrels in Union Square as very different. In the quest of development, I think a vision of development efforts have kind of created a very different imagination among people in the general sense, where people would see this as a storehouse of resources as opposed to what an ecological eye would now see. And I think in general, all of this work, if we put an overarching picture on this, the judgments about the natural world are how we come to see nature and the place that it occupies in our identities. A democratic, an inclusive, and an egalitarian nature is a nature that people have learned to see. So when we wake up in a hiking spot or in a camping trip, we feel intentionally relational to nature. And we don't feel the same way in our close encounters in New York City. Why? Because, some nature has been labeled in a certain way and some others have been labeled in a certain way. The Anthropocene is also a cultural idea that is lending us to a new environmental imagination. And I think over the years, when I do all of this work, a lot of kids actually write to me, from kids in Egypt to kids in Amsterdam or Barcelona. They ask me how to make these robot plant things, or how do I do cyborg botany. And really what I'm thinking is of the generation that had these relations and the generations that now will. When I'm putting this work out, I'm also not doing it in the very same way as a researcher that is just publishing. I would also like to go out and work with the people in botanical gardens where we send out this work, where people can question, break, reframe, and ask again. And this is where the same thing that we started with in terms of not being bound by the digital world's ones and zeros, but really kind of having a bigger picture in mind where you understand that nature in general has a lot of range of doing different things in a very different way than what we have come to understand. That imagination needs to change, and all of these work kind of push different knobs and pulleys in different directions to change that imagination.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been really fascinating, and highly recommend to our listeners that you check out the links that will be in the show notes, videos to look at, papers to read, etc. We'll make sure that you have a bit more of an experience than you're going to have just listening. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here today.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy our podcast, please subscribe on Substack or your favorite podcast platform. And please leave a positive rating or comment. Sharing your positive feedback helps us reach more people and connect them with the world's great minds. Seriously, a review on Apple Podcasts is a big deal. And if you like how we think, then contact us about our speaking and workshops and human-centered product design. You can learn more about us at getsonder.com, and you can contact us at hello@getsonder.com. You can learn more about making better decisions in our book, Make Better Decisions, How to Improve Your Decision-Making in the Digital Age. The book is an essential guide to practicing the cognitive skills needed for making better decisions in the age of data, algorithms, and AI. Please check it out at mbd.zone, on Amazon, bookshop.org, or place an order through your favorite local bookstore.
Stay